The Old Kingdom of Egypt is also known as the Age of the Pyramids or the Age of the Pyramid Builders, because it contains the Great Fourth Dynasty, during which King Sneferu mastered the craft of pyramid construction, and the pyramids of Giza were built under the reigns of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. The historical documents of this time, the 4th to 6th dynasties of Egypt, are sparse, and historians consider the history of the era as literally written in stone, and mainly architectural in that academics have been able to build a history through the statues and their inscriptions. The pyramids themselves provide little information about their architects, but adjacent funerary shrines and stelae provide the king's names and other significant information. In addition, carvings in stone discovered elsewhere during the period document different events and the dates on which they happened. Lastly, the mausoleum of the 5th dynasty's last monarch, Unas, contained the first pyramid texts, detailed drawings and writings inside the tomb that cast light on the religious views of the period. During the Old Kingdom of Egypt, the elite standardized art and figures were produced uniformly to reflect the tastes of Memphis, the capital. Although other art forms such as painting and literature exhibit more skill in the Old Kingdom, statues from the late early dynastic and early Old Kingdom periods are very comparable. The Old Kingdom's most famous works of art are the Pyramids of Giza and the Great Sphinx of Giza, both of which remain today. Although smaller structures were crafted with the same precision and beauty, in reality, Egyptians placed great importance on Old Kingdom art and architecture in later ages. Although all levels of society may have shared the same religious systems, social inequality persisted even after death. The only significant impediment to reaching an afterlife was being buried outside of Egypt. Egyptians thought that, to be reborn, they needed to be buried in Egypt. If they died abroad, their relatives went to tremendous pains to bring their bodies back for burial, so those correct funerary rituals could be performed and they could be buried in their native land, allowing them to enter the afterlife. To coordinate the labor force that constructed the pyramids at Giza and elsewhere during this time, unprecedented bureaucratic efficiency was needed, and this bureaucracy could only function under a powerful central authority. At the top of the pyramid that represented Egyptian society, the monarch stood. He was granted ownership of all of Egypt by the gods, at least in theory. The literate and illiterate classes were divided in the Egyptian social structure. The literate class was the ruling class. They were a small fraction of the population, but they were the main criteria for determining the character of ancient Egyptian society and everything we knew about the civilization. Individuals were frequently more important than the positions they held. As a result, while the king established the scope of bureaucratic power, effective administration was ultimately dependent on the same pool of literal aristocrats without whom the king could not govern, and we'll state some of them as follows. Because an Egyptian king could not personally control every area of society, the role of the vizier was established as early as the early dynastic period. The vizier, who can be assimilated into a form of prime minister, assigned responsibility to other members of the court, sent communications through scribes, and managed the military, regional governors' activities, public works projects, and tax collections, among other things. Huni, the last king of the 3rd dynasty, was long thought to have initiated the massive building projects of the Old Kingdom by constructing the Mitam Pyramid. But credit for the Mitam Pyramid goes to Sneferu, the first king of the 4th dynasty, who may have been Huni's son by one of his minor queens. Sneferu began the Old Kingdom's golden era, with his most noteworthy achievements being the 2 pyramids constructed for him at Djoser. Sneferu started his work with the pyramid at Mitam, known as the False Pyramid, due to its shape. It resembles a tower more than a pyramid, and its exterior casing is surrounded by a massive mound of gravel. The Pyramid of Mitam was Egypt's first real pyramid, but it did not last. This is because changes were made to Imhotep's initial pyramid design, causing the exterior casing to sit on sand rather than rock, causing it to fall. The Crooked Period and the Red Pyramid are Sneferu structures at Djoser, or North Pyramid. The Bent Pyramid gets its name from the fact that it rises at a 55-degree angle and then changes to a 43-degree angle of smaller stones, giving the impression of bending in towards the summit. The workers had finished the base and sides before recognizing that a 55-degree angle was too steep, and changing their plan to conclude the job as best they could. Sneferu appears to have grasped the issue and went on to construct his third pyramid. Sneferu appears to have been a ruler unafraid of loss or sorrow. When the Bent Pyramid failed to satisfy his standards, he simply began over. The Red Pyramid, named after the use of reddish limestone in its building, was constructed on a firm foundation for better stability and rose at a 43-degree inclination. The Red Pyramid, 105 meters tall, was Egypt's first effective real pyramid. It was originally encased in white limestone, as were the other later pyramids, which crumbled away over time and were collected by locals for other construction projects. Following in the footsteps of Djoser's complex at Saqqara, Sneferu had mortuary temples and the other structures built around his pyramids, with priests overseeing day-to-day activities once the Red Pyramid was finished. All of this points to the stability of his rule, which he bequeathed to his son Khufu when he died. The ancient Greek authors referred to Khufu as Cheops, and he's best known for his Great Pyramid at Giza. In their works, the Greeks portrayed him as a tyrant who oppressed the people and compelled them to labor for him against their will. This perception may have been created by the tales contained in the Westcar Papyrus, a compilation of 4 stories written about the kings of the 4th dynasty and found by Henry Westcar in around 1824 CE. The papyrus contains 4 tales recounted by Khufu's sons, including one in which King Khufu summons a sorcerer who claims to be able to reconnect a decapitated head to a body. And some academics read his actions in requesting a demonstration as malicious or careless. During the reign of Khufu, Egypt became even wealthier as a result of his military battles against Nubia and Libya, as well as his lucrative trade deals with cities such as Byblos. He also invested in agricultural innovations to improve the livelihoods of his people. During his reign, the world's first documented dam was constructed in Wadi Jarawi, a mountain range west of modern Helwan. This dam improved water availability for farms and others in the town. The Great Pyramid of Giza is the final of the ancient 7 wonders of the world, and a distinguishing emblem of Egypt. It is situated on the Giza Plateau near the modern city of Cairo, and was constructed over 20 years during the rule of Khufu. Although many hypotheses exist regarding the pyramid's purpose, the most generally acknowledged idea is that it was built as a tomb for the king. However, how it was constructed remains a mystery to this day. Historians continue to dispute the idea of ramps going around the outside of the building to move the blocks into position. These theories persist despite a growing body of evidence proving that the pyramid was constructed by the ancient Egyptians using technical means that were most likely so common to them that they felt no need to document them. Nonetheless, the complexity of the interior passages, shafts, and chambers, as well as the nearby Osiris shaft, encourages the persistence of these fringe theories, as does the mystery of how the pyramid was built at all, and its orientation to cardinal points. A prominent figure during that time, called Hemayunu, was the vizier during the reign of Khufu in the 4th dynasty, and one of the king's relatives. He was in charge of building his Great Pyramid and keeping an eye over its construction works, and he was buried near Khufu's pyramid. The construction work of the pyramid was done by expert and unskilled laborers employed by the state for the job. These employees either offered to pay off a debt, performed community service, or were paid for their time. The annual inundation of the Nile River was important for Egyptian survival because it distributed rich soil from the riverbank all across the shore's farmlands. However, it also made farming those lands impossible during the flood. During these times, the government supplied work for farms by constructing large monuments. These were the individuals who performed the real, physical labor of moving stones, elevating obelisks, constructing temples, and constructing the pyramids that continue to amaze and motivate people today. Khufu was replaced by a family member outside the legal line called Djoser after his death. Djoser was Khufu's son, but he did not appear to be his designated heir. Some scholars believe Djoser built the Great Sphinx of Giza, while others believe Khafre, his sibling and successor, built it. The Sphinx is the world's biggest monolithic monument, showing a recumbent lion's torso with a king's head and visage. Historically, this king's visage has been identified as Khafre's, but Dobrev and others believe it's Khufu's. It appears to have been constructed by Khafre because it is exactly in line with his pyramid complex, and the Sphinx's face resembles Khafre more than Khufu. Khafre's pyramid is the second largest in Giza, and his complex is almost as big as his father's. Little is known about his rule. According to Egyptian texts, he continued his father's policies and government model by concentrating power in the hands of his closest family members and exerting strict control over policies and laws. Following Khafre's demise, succession was temporarily disrupted again when Baka, Djedefre's son, took the throne. He did not even rule for a year before Menkaure, Khafre's son, took over as monarch. Both the Greeks and the Egyptian writings praise Menkaure. Menkaure, like his father and grandpa before him, started construction on his Giza pyramid and shrine complex. Menkaure's pyramid and complex are smaller than the other two, which represent a significant development in the history of the Old Kingdom, and one of the causes of its collapse. The resources required to construct the Great Pyramid were no longer accessible during Menkaure's period, but he did his best to establish an everlasting residence on par with his fathers and grandfathers. Quenra, Menkaure's son and designated successor, perished while this pyramid was being constructed, upsetting the dynastic succession, and Menkaure died before the pyramid complex was finished. Despite reigning for 30 years, he was unable to finish the work of his predecessors, which many historians attribute to the dwindling resources at his disposal. Shepseskaf, Menkaure's successor, finished Menkaure's structure at Giza but was buried in a relatively modest mastaba at Saqqara. As previously stated, the monarchs diverted immense resources to their funerary structures and buildings, but these temples and sanctuaries were increasingly under the authority of the priests who managed them, rather than the king. Although the Giza Plateau is now an old, sand-swept location on the outskirts of Cairo, it was a city of the deceased, inhabited by the living who tended to it during Menkaure's time. Giza had priests' houses, shrines, worker accommodations, stores, factories, breweries, and all the amenities of a small metropolis. The civilian life in ancient Egypt was very active. The lowest social class consisted of peasant farmers who did not own the land on which they worked on or the houses in which they resided. The monarch, members of the court, nomarchs, and priests owned the land. To begin the day, peasants would say, "Let us work for the nobility." Peasants were virtually always farmers, regardless of what other trade they practiced. They cultivated and harvested their crops, giving the majority to the landowner while keeping part for themselves. Most had private gardens, which the ladies maintained while the men worked in the fields. The lowest stratum of society created the items utilized in commerce, allowing the civilization as a whole to survive. These peasants were also part of the workforce that erected Egypt's pyramids and other monuments. When the Nile River's banks overflowed, farming became difficult, and the men and women went to work on the king's projects. This labor was always rewarded, and no literary or physical evidence supports the assertion that any of Egypt's major monuments were erected by slave labor. Work building monuments like the pyramid and associated burial complexes, temples, and obelisks provided the peasantry with the sole possibility of upward mobility. Skilled painters and engravers in particular were in high demand in Egypt, and were paid more than unskilled laborers who merely hauled the stones for the construction from one location to another. Peasant farmers might also raise their status by learning a craft and producing the vases, bowls, plates, and other ceramics that people need. Skilled carpenters could make a fortune by making tables, desks, chairs, beds, and storage chests, while painters were needed to decorate upper-class dwellings, castles, tombs, and monuments. Brewers were likewise held in high regard, and breweries were occasionally controlled by women. They appear to have been operated on by females in early Egyptian history. Beer was the most popular beverage in ancient Egypt, and it was commonly utilized as a kind of recompense. 3 times a day, workers on the Giza plateau were given a beer ration. The deity Osiris was said to have provided the drink to the people, and breweries were overseen by the goddess Tenene. Marriages were more secular than religious in ancient Egypt. The parents planned the majority of weddings in any of the classes. Girls were often married at the age of 12, and boys at the age of 15. Royal offspring were frequently promised to foreign monarchs as babies to seal treaties. The ancient Egyptians' lives were not all labor. They found plenty of time to have fun by participating in sports, board games, and other activities. Hockey, handball, archery, swimming, tug-of-war, gymnastics, rowing, and a sport known as water jousting, which was a sea battle played in small boats on the Nile River in which a jouster tried to knock the other out of his boat, while the second team member maneuvered the craft, were all ancient Egyptian sports. The festivals of ancient Egypt were individually distinct in their own right, depending on the nature of the occasion, but they all had one thing in common: drinking and feasting. The Egyptian diet consisted mostly of grains, wheat, and vegetables. The meat was incredibly expensive, and only royalty could afford it. The 4th dynasty ended with Shepsekhof's brief reign, and the 5th started with much less hope. The 5th dynasty is known as the Sun King's dynasty because so many of their titles contain the name of the deity Ra, usually given as Re. The first 3 of these rulers, Userkaf, Sahur, and Kakai, would later be memorialized as divinely chosen in the Westkar papyrus tale, The Birth of the Kings. The dynasty starts with King Userkaf, but a lady called Kenkaz, most likely a daughter of Menkar, appears prominently in the Egyptian texts as mother of 2 kings of Upper and Lower Egypt, though it's unclear who those monarchs were. Her monument is the 4th Pyramid at Giza, and she was a significant person. Not much is known about her. Userkaf is best renowned for his work on the Temple of the Sun and Abusir. This structure represents a significant divergence from the position of the monarch at the beginning of the 4th dynasty, and the beginning of the end of Giza as the king's necropolis. The sun deity Ra was now venerated directly by the people through the priesthood, and the king's position as the god's primary representative was reduced. Userkaf's son Sahur replaced him and constructed his funerary complex at Abusir near the Temple of the Sun. Sahur was a capable monarch who led the first Egyptian expedition to Punt and arranged significant trade treaties with other countries. Punt, on the other hand, was one of his biggest accomplishments, as it became an important source of many of Egypt's most valuable resources, and in time was regarded as a legendary country of the gods. Sahur constructed his own temple to the sun in Abusir and was the first to use palmiform columns in the building, which would later become the norm for columns throughout Egypt. Sahur's war exploits and cautious resource management enriched the nation, as demonstrated by the intricate work done on his mortuary complex and the inscriptions discovered. His son, Neferu Kakai, succeeded him. Inscriptions suggest he was a good king and well-regarded, but little is known of his tenure except that the priesthood got even more dominant during his control. His son, Neferu succeeded him but perished young, possibly around the age of 20. He was followed by King Shepsekhar. Nusir-Ini succeeds him, and the priests of Ra acquire even more authority during his rule. The bureaucracy of the temples and mortuary buildings grew as well, putting a burden on royal coffers, which paid for sanctuary care and maintenance. Menkaure replaced him, but little is known about his rule other than the fact that he was the last monarch to construct a temple to the sun. Djedkaraisi replaced him in the late 25th to mid-24th century BC. The roots of Djedkaraisi are unclear. He's not regarded as Menkaure-Kayu's son, but he may be connected. To keep the economy stable, he reforms the administration and the clergy extensively during his rule. Djedkaraisi refused the customary practice of erecting a shrine to the sun deity and decreased the number of clerics required to maintain funerary structures. He also arranged the Second Punt expedition, which enriched Egypt and reinforced relations with Punt. The most important element of Djedkaraisi's reign, however, was the decentralization of the government in Memphis, which gave local authorities more authority. Djedkaraisi was replaced by his son Unas, the reign of whom is little documented. Unas was the first Egyptian king to have the interior of his tomb decorated and inscribed with what became known as the pyramid texts. These inscriptions depict the king in communion with Ra and Osiris. The position of the king was already considerably reduced when the 6th dynasty started. Local officials and bureaucrats built more elaborate tombs than nobles during the rule of the first monarch, Teti. Teti was killed by his bodyguards according to the 3rd century BCE historian Manetho, an act that would have been inconceivable earlier. He was replaced by Userkure, who may have been involved in the assassination plan. His reign was brief, and he was followed by Pepi I, during whom the nomarchs gained authority. By the end of the Old Kingdom, the political power had fragmented and the system was decentralized. The restoration of central power was a lengthy process that lasted well into the 12th dynasty. Because of the breakdown of central power, political authority passed into the hands of the nomarchs, who took complete control. This pattern persisted during the reigns of Merenre-Nemtumsaf I and Neferkare-Pepi II, who ascended to the kingdom as a child and perished as an old man, signifying an incredible rule of nearly a century. During Pepi II's lengthy rule, the Old Kingdom gradually crumbled. The increasing influence of provincial nomarchs and the clergy eroded the central government's and king's authority. Pepi II was followed by Merenre-Nemtumsaf II, with a very short reign, and the dynasty ended with Necherkar, who was identified by some scholars and Egyptologists as the Queen Nitocris from Herodotus's account of an Egyptian queen who avenges her brother's murder by drowning his killers at a banquet. Pepi II had outlived any heirs to the throne, and appears to have been a pretty ineffective monarch in his final years. When drought caused famine in the country, there was no effective central authority to react to it. The Old Kingdom terminated with the 6th dynasty because no powerful ruler ascended to the throne to guide the people. Local authorities focused on their areas and lacked the means and motivation to assist the rest of the nation. As the 6th dynasty died out, Egypt gradually descended into the first intermediate period.